June 4th, 1942, 0623 hours. Above the waters of Midway Atoll, Central Pacific. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her Grumman F4F Wildcat as Japanese Zero fighters swarmed through the morning sky like angry hornets. Her squadron was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and fighting for survival against what many considered the most formidable fighter aircraft in the world. The Zero could turn inside anything the Americans flew, climb faster, and had already proven its dominance from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns across Asia, believed their aircraft and their skills were unbeatable. Within 18 months, they would discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The mathematics of engineering and industrial might were about to deliver a lesson that would shatter every assumption Japanese aviators carried about American capabilities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Mitchell survived that day over Midway, but barely. Her Wildcat took 17 hits from Zero cannons, the armor plating behind her seat stopping rounds that would have killed her. She limped back to the carrier Yorktown with hydraulics failing and fuel streaming from punctured tanks. In the ready room afterward, she and her fellow pilots shared the same grim assessment. The Zero was faster in a climb, more agile in turns, and could operate at altitudes where American fighters struggled. Japanese pilots had years of combat experience, and their confidence bordered on arrogance. They performed victory rolls after kills, flew in loose formations that demonstrated their superiority, and treated American pilots like students facing masters. But something was already happening in American factories and design bureaus that would change everything. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had entered service in 1940, and by 1942, it dominated Pacific skies. The aircraft weighed just 3,704 pounds empty, powered by a 940-horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine. Its light weight gave it extraordinary maneuverability. Zeros could complete a full turn in just 16 seconds at optimal speed. They could climb to 20,000 feet in under 8 minutes. Their range exceeded 1,900 miles with drop tanks, allowing them to escort bombers on missions that seemed impossible to American planners. Japanese pilot training was rigorous and brutal. Only the most skilled aviators earned the right to fly Zeros. They spent years mastering their craft, learning aerobatics that pushed aircraft to their limits. By the time they reached combat squadrons, they were among the finest pilots in the world. Their aircraft philosophy matched their cultural values. The Zeros sacrificed pilot protection for performance. No armor plating protected the pilot. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing capabilities. The airframe was deliberately lightweight, trading durability for agility.
Japanese naval aviators believed they were invincible, and combat results seemed to prove them right. Their kill ratios in early engagements sometimes reached 20-1 in their favor. American pilots who survived encounters reported the same thing. You cannot turn with a Zero. You cannot climb with a Zero. You cannot outrun a Zero in level flight. Conventional fighter tactics were suicide against such an aircraft. But American engineers were studying every piece of intelligence, every combat report, every photograph of the Zero. In June 1942, something extraordinary happened that would accelerate American understanding. On Akutan Island in Alaska's Aleutian Chain, a Zero fighter crashed relatively intact after its pilot was killed during the landing attempt. American recovery teams found the aircraft nearly complete. They shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Engineers swarmed over the captured Zero like scientists examining an alien spacecraft. They measured every dimension, tested every component, flew the aircraft repeatedly to understand its capabilities and limitations. What they discovered validated pilot reports, but also revealed critical weaknesses. The Zero was indeed remarkably agile, but only at speeds below 230 miles per hour. Above that speed, control surfaces stiffened dramatically. The lightweight construction that gave such maneuverability made the aircraft vulnerable to damage. A single burst from heavy machine guns could tear wings off. The lack of armor meant any hit on the pilot was likely fatal. Most importantly, American test pilots discovered the Zero could not dive at high speed. The aircraft's lightweight construction limited dive speeds to around 350 miles per hour before structural failure became likely. Control surfaces became almost immovable in high-speed dives. This weakness would become the foundation of new American tactics. But tactics alone wouldn't win the air war. America needed a fighter aircraft that could match or exceed the Zero's strengths while exploiting its weaknesses. That aircraft was already in development. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island had been working on a new fighter design since early 1941. Roy Grumman himself oversaw the project, determined to create an aircraft that would dominate Pacific skies. The design team included engineers who had worked on previous Grumman fighters, but this project demanded something entirely new. The F6F Hellcat was conceived with a specific mission: destroy Zeros in large numbers. Everything about the design reflected this goal. Where the Zero was light, the Hellcat would be robust. Where the Zero sacrificed protection for maneuverability, the Hellcat would protect its pilot while maintaining competitive performance. Where Japanese production emphasized handcrafted quality in limited numbers, American production would emphasize mass manufacturing of reliable aircraft. The Hellcat's development benefited from the captured Zero and from combat reports flooding back from the Pacific. Engineers knew exactly what performance envelope they needed to achieve. The aircraft had to climb well enough to engage Zeros. It had to dive faster than Zeros could follow. It had to withstand battle damage that would destroy a Zero. And it had to be simple enough for rapid training of new pilots and mass production by workers with limited experience.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first XF6F prototype flew on June 26, 1942, just 3 weeks after the Battle of Midway. Test pilots immediately recognized they had something special. The aircraft handled beautifully, with none of the quirks that plagued earlier designs. It was fast, reaching 376 miles per hour in level flight. It climbed strongly to altitude. Most importantly, it dove like a boulder, reaching speeds where Zeros couldn't follow without risking structural failure. The production version that emerged carried 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing. These weapons fired armor-piercing and incendiary rounds that could shred a Zero's unprotected structure. Later versions would carry even heavier armament. Behind the pilot sat an armored plate of hardened steel, thick enough to stop 20-millimeter cannon rounds. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that swelled when punctured to seal bullet holes. The engine, a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, produced 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the Zero's output. American industrial capacity was about to demonstrate scales that Japanese planners had considered impossible. Grumman's factory in Bethpage, New York, was already producing Wildcat fighters, but management converted production lines to the new Hellcat with remarkable speed. The first production F6F rolled off the assembly line in October 1942, just 4 months after the prototype's first flight. This pace would have been considered miraculous in Japanese industry. For Grumman, it was just the beginning. By January 1943, production reached 150 aircraft per month. By March, it hit 245 per month. The factory operated around the clock in 3 shifts. Women comprised over 40% of the workforce, many with no previous manufacturing experience. They were building fighters that matched or exceeded Japanese quality while producing them at rates Japan couldn't imagine. The assembly process reflected American manufacturing philosophy. Every component was designed for interchangeability. Any engine could fit any airframe. Any gun could mount in any wing. Workers specialized in specific tasks, repeating them hundreds of times until they achieved both speed and precision. This was mass production applied to military aircraft on a scale never before attempted. Japanese aircraft production remained largely artisanal. Skilled craftsmen hand-fitted components. Each Zero required extensive individual adjustment during assembly. Quality was high, but quantity remained limited. Mitsubishi and Nakajima together produced roughly 350 Zeros per month at peak production. Grumman alone would eventually exceed 600 Hellcats per month, and that was just one factory producing one fighter type. Lieutenant Mitchell transitioned to the F6F Hellcat in March 1943, when her squadron received the new fighters aboard the carrier Essex. The difference was immediately apparent. Climbing into the cockpit, she was surrounded by armor plating. The aircraft felt solid, substantial, like sitting inside a tank compared to the Wildcat's lighter construction. The engine rumbled with power that vibrated through the airframe. During her first flight, she pushed the Hellcat through maneuvers that would have been dangerous in a Wildcat.
The aircraft responded predictably, without the vices that made carrier landings an adventure in earlier fighters. She took it into a dive, pushing past 400 miles per hour. The controls remained responsive. She could still pull out smoothly, something the intelligence reports said Zeros couldn't manage. Her squadron mates shared her enthusiasm. These were mostly new pilots, fresh from training with perhaps 60 hours in fighters. They were about to face Japanese aviators with years of experience. But the Hellcat gave them advantages that would level the field. The tactical doctrine developed around the Hellcat exploited every weakness intelligence had discovered in the Zero. Never turn with a Zero at low speed. Never engage in the turning dogfights where Japanese pilots excelled. Instead, American pilots were taught the boom and zoom technique. Dive from altitude, fire a burst, use speed to climb back to altitude before the Zero could respond. The Hellcat's superior dive speed and climb rate made this possible. If a Zero got on your tail, don't try to out-turn it. Instead, roll into a high-speed dive. The Zero couldn't follow without risking structural failure. Its controls would stiffen, making it nearly impossible to aim. Meanwhile, the Hellcat maintained control at speeds that would tear a Zero apart. These tactics were revolutionary because they abandoned traditional fighter combat principles. Since World War I, fighter pilots had valued turning ability above all else. The more maneuverable fighter won the dogfight. But Americans realized that maneuverability meant nothing if you couldn't bring guns to bear. The Hellcat's speed and dive performance meant American pilots could choose when to engage and when to disengage. They controlled the terms of combat. The first major test came in August 1943 during operations around the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Mitchell's squadron flew from Essex as part of a large strike against Japanese positions. They expected to encounter Zeros defending the target area. Intelligence reported a strong Japanese fighter presence, including some of their most experienced pilots. As the strike group approached, radar detected Japanese fighters climbing to intercept. Mitchell's squadron, flying top cover at 22,000 feet, spotted them first. Roughly 30 Zeros in loose formations climbing aggressively toward the American bombers below. Mitchell keyed her radio. "Razor flight, this is Razor leader. Enemy fighters below, 11 o'clock low. We're going in fast. Remember your training. One pass, then extend and climb. Do not get slow with these guys." She rolled her Hellcat inverted and pulled into a steep dive. The aircraft accelerated smoothly past 350 miles per hour. The Zero formation grew larger in her gun sight. She selected a fighter on the formation's edge, led it slightly, and squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns roared. The Zero seemed to disintegrate. Pieces flew off the wings, the canopy shattered, the aircraft rolled over and fell away trailing smoke and flame. Mitchell kept her dive going, building speed. In her mirrors, she saw other Zeros trying to follow, but they were already falling behind. Her Hellcat had the speed advantage. At 8,000 feet, she pulled out of the dive, the G-forces pressing her into the seat. The Hellcat's robust airframe handled the stress without complaint. She pushed the throttle forward and began climbing back to altitude. Behind her, the radio chatter told the story. Her squadron had destroyed 6 Zeros.
The Japanese pilots were confused. These weren't Wildcats that they could chase down and destroy in turning fights. These new American fighters were faster, more heavily armed, and seemingly immune to the tactics that had worked for 2 years. When Zeros tried to follow the diving Hellcats, their controls became too heavy to aim accurately. When they tried to climb after them, the Hellcats outclimbed them. The battle lasted 20 minutes. Mitchell's squadron made 3 more diving attacks, each time destroying Zeros before climbing back to safety. Japanese pilots grew increasingly desperate. Some tried to ram American fighters. Others dove away entirely, abandoning the fight. When the American strike group turned for home, they left 12 Zeros falling into the ocean. Mitchell's squadron hadn't lost a single aircraft. Back aboard Essex, the intelligence officers debriefed every pilot. The pattern was clear. The Hellcat's advantages in speed, firepower, and durability were decisive. Japanese tactical skill meant nothing when American pilots refused to fight on Japanese terms. The boom and zoom tactics worked exactly as designed. This engagement was repeated across the Pacific as more squadrons transitioned to Hellcats. By September 1943, the F6F equipped most American carrier fighter squadrons. The aircraft was proving everything its designers promised. Production continued accelerating. By the end of 1943, Grumman had delivered over 2,500 Hellcats. The factory employed over 25,000 workers, producing fighters that were systematically destroying Japanese air power. Quality remained high despite the production pace. Grumman's engineering team had designed the aircraft for ease of maintenance. Mechanics could change an engine in under 4 hours. Battle damage that would require weeks to repair on a Zero could be fixed overnight on a Hellcat. Japanese intelligence began receiving disturbing reports from frontline units. The new American fighter was superior in almost every meaningful way. It was faster, more durable, more heavily armed, and produced in numbers that seemed impossible. Worse, American pilot quality was improving rapidly. New pilots were being trained effectively in the Hellcat's straightforward handling characteristics. They weren't master aviators like Japanese aces, but they didn't need to be. The Hellcat's advantages meant average pilots could defeat experienced Japanese aviators. This was a nightmare for Japanese commanders. Their pilot training program was already breaking down. Losses over the past year had killed many experienced instructors. Fuel shortages limited training flights. New pilots reached combat squadrons with perhaps half the training hours their predecessors had received. They were being thrown against American pilots flying superior aircraft, and the results were predictable. By November 1943, the transformation of Pacific air combat was undeniable. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had personally shot down 9 Zero fighters without losing a single wingman. Her success wasn't due to superior flying skills compared to Japanese aces. She was a good pilot, but not exceptional by pre-war standards. Her advantage was systematic. The Hellcat gave her speed to control engagements, firepower to destroy targets quickly,
and protection to survive mistakes. Japanese pilots, no matter how skilled, were flying aircraft that couldn't match these capabilities.
The strategic implications were becoming clear to both sides. American carriers could operate with confidence knowing their fighter cover was superior. Japanese carriers had to be increasingly cautious, knowing that any encounter with Hellcat-equipped American forces would likely result in heavy losses. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 demonstrated Hellcat dominance on a larger scale. American forces were invading the Gilbert Islands, and Japanese commanders launched major airstrikes from their bases in the Marshall Islands. Over 3 days of combat, they sent nearly 200 aircraft against the American fleet. Hellcat fighters from multiple carriers engaged them in what became a systematic slaughter. American pilots destroyed over 150 Japanese aircraft, including dozens of Zeros, while losing only 29 Hellcats to all causes, including anti-aircraft fire. The kill ratio was approaching 6-to-1, and this was against some of Japan's better remaining pilots. Mitchell flew 4 missions during Tarawa operations. On the second day, her division intercepted a formation of 18 Zeros escorting bombers toward the invasion fleet. The Japanese pilots still flew with the confidence of early war victories, maintaining loose formations that showed their skill. Mitchell led her division in a slashing attack from above. 4 Hellcats dove through the Zero formation, guns blazing. 3 Zeros fell away burning before the Japanese pilots could react. The remaining Zeros broke formation, trying to engage in the turning dogfights where they held advantages, but Mitchell's pilots didn't cooperate. They extended away at high speed, climbed back to altitude, and attacked again. This time, 5 more Zeros went down. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. They had trained for years to master dogfighting techniques that American pilots simply refused to engage in. Their beautiful aerobatic maneuvers meant nothing when Hellcats attacked from above at speeds they couldn't match. Some Japanese pilots began showing reluctance to engage. Combat reports noted Zeros breaking off attacks when they spotted Hellcats, something unthinkable in 1942. The Americans were winning not just through superior equipment, but through superior tactics enabled by that equipment. Japanese commanders recognized the crisis. Their after-action reports, captured later in the war, expressed frustration and fear. One report from a carrier air group commander stated that American fighters had achieved complete superiority. Japanese pilots were being systematically destroyed by aircraft they couldn't match and tactics they couldn't counter. Meanwhile, American production continued its relentless acceleration. By early 1944, Grumman was producing over 500 Hellcats per month. The factory had expanded to cover vast areas of Long Island. Workers who had never seen an aircraft before the war were now building fighters with precision that matched or exceeded pre-war quality standards. This was American industrial might in its purest form. The workforce included housewives.
Quality control inspectors checked every aircraft before it left the factory. The result was reliability that Japanese aircraft couldn't match. Hellcats flew mission after mission with minimal maintenance. Battle damage that would ground Japanese fighters for weeks could be repaired quickly. Engines ran reliably for hundreds of hours between overhauls. Lieutenant Mitchell received her 10th kill in January 1944 during operations around the Marshall Islands. The engagement was almost routine by this point. Her division spotted 8 Zeros at lower altitude. They dove, destroyed 3 in the first pass, climbed away before the survivors could respond. The remaining Zeros fled rather than continue the engagement. This was the new reality of Pacific air combat. Japanese pilots, even experienced ones, were choosing survival over glory. After landing back aboard Essex, Mitchell walked past rows of Hellcats being serviced for the next mission. Mechanics swarmed over them with practiced efficiency. Ammunition was being loaded. Fuel tanks were being topped off. These aircraft would fly again in hours, and they would dominate again. She thought about the Japanese pilots she was facing. They were brave men fighting for their country just as she was. But they had been given inadequate tools by leaders who didn't understand modern warfare. The Zero had been revolutionary in 1940, but by 1944 it was obsolete. Japanese industry couldn't produce enough of them, couldn't develop replacements, couldn't even keep existing aircraft properly maintained as supply lines collapsed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 would prove the ultimate demonstration of Hellcat's superiority. Japanese naval aviation launched its last major carrier offensive, sending over 400 aircraft against American forces invading the Mariana Islands. American carriers fielded over 450 Hellcats, among other aircraft types. The result was the most one-sided air battle in naval history. Over 2 days of combat, Japanese forces lost approximately 350 aircraft. American losses totaled around 30 aircraft, and many of those were operational accidents rather than combat losses. The kill ratio exceeded 10-to-1. Lieutenant Mitchell flew 3 missions during what pilots were already calling the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name reflected the ease with which American pilots destroyed Japanese aircraft. On her first mission, she shot down 2 Zeros in less than 3 minutes. Neither Japanese pilot seemed to have any idea how to counter the Hellcat's advantages. They tried to turn, she dove away and climbed. They tried to climb after her, she outclimbed them. When she had the advantage, she dove in and fired. Both times, the Zeros exploded under the weight of .50 caliber fire. The second mission was similar. She destroyed 1 Zero and damaged 2 others before running low on ammunition. The sky was full of burning aircraft falling into the ocean, and almost all of them were Japanese. American pilots were experiencing what could only be described as a massacre. Japanese pilots weren't incompetent. American tactical doctrine had eliminated Japanese advantages while maximizing American strengths. The result was inevitable. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered from the Marianas Turkey Shoot. They had lost not just aircraft, which could theoretically be replaced, but experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced in any meaningful time frame. Japanese pilot training programs were collapsing under fuel shortages and lack of experienced instructors. New pilots reached combat units with barely enough training to take off and land, let alone fight effectively. By contrast, American pilot training continued improving. New pilots spent months in training, accumulating hundreds of flight hours before reaching combat squadrons. They learned in aircraft similar to the Hellcat, making the transition to combat operations smooth. When they reached fleet carriers, experienced pilots like Mitchell mentored them through their first missions. The system was producing competent fighter pilots faster than Japanese forces could kill them. Production numbers told the story starkly. By the end of 1944, Grumman had produced over 8,000 Hellcats. Total Japanese Zero production for the entire war would reach approximately 10,900 aircraft. But Zeros had been in production since 1940, while Hellcats only began reaching squadrons in early 1943. American production rates were exceeding Japanese total production. More importantly, American aircraft were surviving. Hellcats returned from missions that would have destroyed Zeros. Their robust construction and pilot protection meant they could absorb damage and keep flying. Japanese after-action reports expressed amazement at how much punishment American fighters could withstand. One report described a Hellcat that had been hit by over 30 rounds from Zero cannons, but still flew back to its carrier and landed safely. Lieutenant Mitchell experienced this firsthand in August 1944 during operations over the Philippines. Her division engaged a large formation of Japanese fighters, and in the chaos of combat, a Zero got behind her. She heard the cannon rounds hitting her aircraft. The Hellcat shuddered as 20mm shells punched through the wings and fuselage. She rolled into a split-S maneuver, diving away at maximum speed. The Zero couldn't follow. Back at altitude, she assessed the damage. multiple holes in both wings, one through the vertical stabilizer, another through the engine cowling that had miraculously missed critical components. The armored seat back behind her had stopped 2 rounds that would have been fatal. She flew back to Essex with a damaged but functional aircraft. Mechanics counted 37 holes. They had the Hellcat repaired and ready to fly again within 18 hours. That same engagement had cost the Japanese formation 12 aircraft destroyed. Mitchell thought about the Zero pilot who had hit her. He had done everything right, achieved the perfect attack position, fired accurately. But his cannons weren't powerful enough to destroy a Hellcat quickly, and the aircraft's speed allowed her to escape before he could finish the job. If their positions had been reversed, if she had gotten that perfect shot on a Zero, her 650 caliber guns would have torn it apart in the first burst. The Philippine campaign saw Hellcats operating in massive numbers. American carrier task forces fielded over 1,000 fighters, the vast majority being F6Fs. They achieved air superiority so complete that Japanese forces could barely operate during daylight hours.
American pilots were destroying Japanese aircraft at ratios that sometimes exceeded 20 to 1. The mathematical certainty of American victory was becoming undeniable. By late 1944, Japan had effectively lost the air war. They couldn't produce enough aircraft, couldn't train enough pilots, couldn't develop new technologies to match American advances. The Hellcat had been a crucial element in this defeat, but it represented something larger. It demonstrated that democratic industrial societies could organize and produce more effectively than totalitarian states. The same factories that had made cars and appliances before the war were now making fighters that dominated the skies. Lieutenant Mitchell received her promotion to captain in October 1944, recognizing her 15 confirmed victories and her leadership of a successful fighter squadron. She had survived 2 years of combat, something that would have been unlikely flying Wildcats against Zeros in 1942. The Hellcat had kept her alive while allowing her to excel. By January 1945, she was training new pilots in the tactics that had proven so successful. She emphasized the fundamentals: use your advantages, never fight on the enemy's terms. Speed and firepower win battles, not aerobatics. Protect your wingman, stay disciplined. The Hellcat makes you dangerous, but only if you use it correctly. Her students listened carefully. They knew the statistics. Hellcat pilots were surviving and succeeding at rates that earlier American fighter pilots could only dream of. The aircraft gave them a fighting chance, but proper tactics made them deadly. The final months of the war saw Hellcats conducting operations over the Japanese home islands. American carriers operated with impunity within range of Japanese bases. Their fighter cover so dominant that Japanese forces rarely challenged them. When Japanese pilots did engage, the results were predictable. Hellcats destroyed them in numbers that reflected complete superiority. Mitchell flew her last combat mission in July 1945, escorting bombers over Japanese industrial targets. She encountered 4 Japanese fighters, identified as the newer models that were supposed to match American performance. They didn't. She destroyed one and damaged another before the survivors fled. It was her 18th victory, making her one of the most successful female fighter pilots in history. More importantly, she had helped validate the Hellcat's design and the tactics that made it so effective. When the war ended in August 1945, the statistics told an incredible story. The F6F Hellcat had been credited with destroying over 5,000 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter type. The kill ratio exceeded 19 to 1 in the Hellcat's favor. Grumman had produced 12,275 Hellcats in just over 2 years of production. They had been manufactured by workers who had never built aircraft before the war.
assembled with precision that matched handcrafted Japanese fighters and delivered in numbers that seemed impossible to Japanese planners. The cost per aircraft had decreased throughout production as efficiency improved. By 1945, a Hellcat cost approximately $45,000, less than half what it cost in 1943. This price reduction, while maintaining quality, would have been considered impossible in traditional aircraft manufacturing, but American mass production techniques made it routine.
Japanese pilots who survived the war consistently identified the Hellcat as the weapon that destroyed their air forces. It wasn't just one superior aircraft, they explained. It was thousands of superior aircraft, flown by adequately trained pilots using tactics that negated Japanese advantages while exploiting Japanese weaknesses. Some Japanese veterans expressed respect for the Hellcat's design. It was, they admitted, exactly what a fighter should be in modern warfare: fast, tough, reliable, deadly. The Zero's elegance and maneuverability became irrelevant when they couldn't bring guns to bear before being destroyed. Post-war analysis by military historians consistently ranked the Hellcat among the most successful fighter aircraft ever produced. Its combination of performance, reliability, ease of production, and combat effectiveness created a weapon system that dominated its theater of operations. The Hellcat had proved that wars were won not by superior warriors, but by superior systems. Better training, better tactics, better equipment, better production, better everything. Japanese pilots were brave and skilled, but courage and skill couldn't overcome systematic disadvantages in every aspect of air combat. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell retired from the Navy in 1946 with a chest full of decorations and memories of battles that had changed warfare forever. She had witnessed the transformation of air combat from an arena where individual skill dominated to one where systematic advantages determined outcomes. The Hellcat had been her weapon, but it represented something larger. It proved that democratic societies could organize, produce, and fight more effectively than authoritarian regimes. Every Hellcat that rolled off Grumman's production lines was evidence that free people working together could accomplish more than slaves working for tyrants. Today, the F6F Hellcat is recognized as one of the great fighter aircraft of World War II. Museums worldwide display them as symbols of American industrial power and engineering excellence. For the Japanese pilots who faced them, Hellcats represented the moment they realized the war was lost. Not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they were fighting an enemy with superior resources, superior technology, and superior production capacity. The Hellcat proved that modern warfare was won in factories as much as in cockpits. The greatest fighter pilot in the world couldn't overcome flying an inferior aircraft against an enemy with unlimited replacements. The mathematics were inescapable, and the Hellcat delivered that mathematical certainty with devastating effectiveness. Japanese pilots had laughed at American fighters in 1942, secure in their superiority. By 1945, those who survived weren't laughing. They were recognizing that they had challenged the wrong enemy with the wrong assumptions, and the F6F Hellcat had taught them that lesson, one engagement at a time.